I want to welcome everybody to morning meeting. And, throughout the year, we have a phenomenal list of speakers come to Taft, and we're able to do that because there are several endowed funds by people who are connected to the Taft community, love the community, have gone to the school. And one of the people, the Albert family, has two great funds here. One's a global leadership program and deals with a lot of the speakers that come through Martin Luther King and Black History Month, but they're very committed to social justice. There's a beautiful Hebrew term, tikkun olam, means to mend, to heal, to restore that which is broken in our world. So the Albert family puts up money for that fund, but they also have this very important fund today, HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we have a guest speaker that will be introduced shortly. But I just wanted to say something about their fund. The Albert Family Holocaust Study Fund was created by Bert and Sylvia Albert, parents of Eric Albert, class of 77, Jonathan Albert, class of 79, and Deborah A. Rosemary, class of 82, to enable the Taft community to bring to campus once a year guest speakers that are recognized authorities on the study of the Holocaust during World War II. It is hoped that this experience will help engender continuing knowledge and enable all of us to learn from this really probably the greatest tragedy in the modern era, without a doubt, in history. So there's much to learn here. We have a wonderful speaker this morning, and I've asked from the JSO, Samantha Schwartz, to introduce our speaker. Come on.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Samantha Schwartz, and I'm one of the leaders of the JSO. April 17th was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and with my grandma being a Holocaust survivor and losing many family members, this assembly is really important to me, the Jewish community, and the 6 million Jews that died and we remember the slogan of World War II, never forget. Leah Sills, whose parents and grandparents were Holocaust survivors, lives in New Rochelle, New York, on the same street where she grew up. For many years, she was a lower school librarian at the Riverdale Country School, and now Leah spends her time doing volunteer board work. She gave me 2 truths and 1 lie, so I'll let you guess which one is the lie. She rode her bike once from New York City to Washington, D.C. She met her husband when she was 6 months old, and she ate a fried grasshopper and didn't mind it. She will let you know which one is not true. I am pleased to welcome Leah Sills.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Good morning. It's a nice, cozy morning to settle in for a little story. And thank you to students, staff, administration for allowing me to see you today. Well, I never rode my bike from New York to DC. The other 2 were the truths. The grasshopper, it was not so good. Anyway, very nice to see you. So about 7 years ago, my parents came over to the house with an enormous box of papers of all varieties, little documents that were about that big slips of paper. It was from then on that I became the family historian. We're talking papers in 6 different languages and all mixed up from year to year. My dining room table became my workstation, and it became the biggest mess in the house. First, I had to divide everything by language, so 6 languages: French, Russian, Polish, English. Anyway, it goes on from there. And then by year, and then by month, until I was left with 5 enormous binders about this tall of family history. Today, I get about 25 minutes to spend with you, so I'm gonna speak possibly a little fast at times, and because I was a lower school librarian, I can't break the habit that sometimes I use funny voices when I talk, so you have to forgive me if I go into that mode. So the story today begins with, in the town of Łódź. In Polish, the L with a line through it is pronounced W, so it's Łódź instead of Lodz. In 1939, Łódź had 233,000 Jews living there. I checked, it's the population of Hartford and Waterbury combined. So it was a third of the Łódź population. My grandfather was a ribbon manufacturer. He manufactured velvet ribbons. Velvet ribbons go inside a woman's under the skirt as a liner, or maybe in a woman's blouse here around the wrists. So every summer, he would go to the West to sell to some buyers there. That was his factory in the top over there. You can kind of see the scale of it. And these are some of my grandfather's documents. So he would travel right under the word Poland is where Łódź is. He would travel to the West. And in 1939, in the summer, he said, I'm starting to feel a little nervous about what's happening, what he was seeing. And he said to my grandmother, I don't want to go this year. I'm not feeling so confident. I'm really worried about leaving you. And here is my grandmother, age 29. And she said, if anything happens, she said, of course, you'll come and get us. And this is a photo of my father, Stefan, age 5. I don't know if any of you have a 5-year-old sibling, a 5-year-old cousin, a 5-year-old next door neighbor. Anyway, so my grandfather ended up leaving on his trip. Well, the war started September 1st, 1939. My grandparents were on the phone, my grandfather in Belgium, my grandmother in Łódź, and click, they lost communication. My father said that the Germans walked into his city of Łódź without a shot being fired, that there were many ethnic Germans living in Łódź, and they welcomed the Germans with open arms. This is the apartment building where my grandmother and my father were living. It's at Kopernika 18. It was rather a new building back in 1939. There was a knock at the door, more like a pounding at the door. The Nazis were there, told them to get out. It was time for them to leave. They grabbed a few bags, and don't forget, my grandfather was not there with them. He was stuck in Belgium. It was from there that they went to my grandmother's parents' house at Wilczanska 73. This is a more modern view of the house. You could see the gates over there. It was kind of like a pre-Amazon kind of setup. They were freight forwarders, so products would be sent to them in their warehouse, which was behind the gates, and then it would be shipped from there. This is the basement where my father used to play with his uncle Piotr. That's Peter in Polish. And you could see the insignia on the gates for the Jelen-Rudomin family. They also lived there with my grandparents, aunt, and uncle. These are my grandmother's yellow stars. The Jews were forced to wear them at the start of the war. They don't look like the ones you see in most of museums and things. These were the very early ones. Later on, they learned how to manufacture yellow stars so they could make them en masse. My father, remember, he was only 5 years old. He was not required to wear yellow stars. Children to the age of 10 were not forced to wear them. So here they were, the start of the war. My grandfather, who was in Belgium, you can see Belgium, it's to the left of Germany, right there, kind of north of France in the top right-hand corner. My grandfather tried everything to get them out. He got the Bolivian consul general, who was in Hamburg, Germany, to get them visas. And a visa was a slip of paper that could help them travel from place to place. That was November of 1939. My father got appendicitis, and they could not leave. It was not until January of 1940 when they were finally able to start their escape. And how did they do that? Well, they tried going to Warsaw first, and they saw that Warsaw was not any better. There were bombs being dropped. My father spent time down in an air raid shelter, and if you think that a 5-year-old has no memory, my father still remembered the sights and the sounds, seeing burning buildings, so on and so forth. So here they are, and my grandmother, it was somehow that my grandmother, who hated cooking, had a cook named Clara. Clara took my grandmother and my father to the train station in Poland. Now remember, we're already many months into the war. This is now January. She brought them to the train station with my grandmother's parents. My grandmother's parents started crying. And my grandmother said to her, why are you crying? Like, what's wrong? And her mother said to her, because I'm never going to see you again. And my grandmother, she's 29, she's like, what do you mean you're never going to see me again? And she said, of course you will. And we all know what happens. Or you'll find out. My grandmother took my father by the hand. Remember, a 5-year-old boy. Are 5-year-old boys quiet? Not so much, right? Not so much. Took my father, looked at him, and said, don't open your mouth. And my father froze. She said, don't open your mouth. If anybody looks at you, pretend you're dumb, pretend you're mute. Do not open your mouth. Scared my father to death, because my father had a problem. He didn't speak, he only spoke Polish. And they were about to get on a train from Poland directly into Hamburg, Germany. My grandmother took her yellow stars. She sewed them inside her clothing. She had taken her jewelry. She had sewn that inside her clothing. She got on the train with my father. My father remembers looking out the window of the train as it went through the countryside. He sat there. He was a good boy. He was very obedient. Always was very obedient. Very obedient. But he remembers my grandmother flitting around the train, la la la, totally talking it up with everybody, because my grandma, as it turns out, had been raised in German-speaking private schools. So she spoke German like someone who was born in Germany. They arrived in Hamburg, Germany. They were met by the Bolivian consul general's wife and the Bolivian consul general's son. They stayed the night in Hamburg, Germany. And then finally, January 20, 1940, they were reunited at the Belgian border with my grandfather. Well, didn't last long. Invasion again. They tried to get to South Africa. They tried to get visas to Palestine. They tried to get visas to England. They couldn't get anywhere. They heard, though, that there was a consulate in Bordeaux, France, where they could possibly get a visa. So they went from Belgium into Paris. Sorry, I don't have Paris on the map, but it's a little bit, it's in that direction, almost towards the point. They went from Paris into Bordeaux, France. They had their visas signed. They went through Spain and then into Lisbon. But by the time they got to Lisbon, oh, I'm sorry, they made one stop in Biarritz. I don't know if anyone's been to Biarritz. It's a lovely seaside town. Remember, my grandmother's 29. She's not really all that worried about what's happening back in Poland. So they made it there. They made it to Lisbon. By the time they got to Lisbon, my grandfather had completely run out of money. Here's another miracle, not just Clara the cook who got them to the train station. Somehow, they met a woman named Mrs. Cole, who was from Montclair, New Jersey. Anyone from New Jersey here? Yeah, she was from Montclair, New Jersey. She was there on vacation with her granddaughters. She befriended my grandparents, and not only did she give them money, she also got them passage on a ship, and that's the ship right there, the Nea Hellas. It was a Greek shipping company. My grandmother offered her jewelry that was sewn inside her clothing. Mrs. Cole said, "Don't worry about it." She said, "As soon as you can, when you get to the States, you can come and pay me back." They made it to America July 12, 1940. They landed in Hoboken, New Jersey. That's my dad. Now remember, July, he started first grade in September. First day of school, the teacher said, "Class, good morning. This is Stefan, the refugee boy." Well, you could just imagine this boy who had been traumatized by living through the war now to be called, the refugee boy. And it was from then on that he decided, no, you are no longer going to call me Stefan, call me Stephen. And he learned English listening to baseball and to hockey. And he remained a huge Rangers fan, anyway, for a long time. Those were Abraham and my Grandma Jenny. My dad went on and had 4 children. Went on to become a grandfather. There he is in the bottom right with some birthday cake with some grandchildren. So my dad is sitting in the kitchen one day, it's about 10 years ago, and the phone rings. And he picks up the phone, and all of a sudden, the guy on the other line says, "Hello, is this Stefan?" And my father almost hung up the phone. He thought it was a phone call. He didn't know what it was, and he almost hung up, but in fact, my father said yes, he did not hang up the phone. It was then that a researcher introduced himself and said, "Are you Stefan Rozenfeld did your parents go through Portugal on their way out of Europe?" And my father said, yes, they did. The man said, "Do you have their passports?" And my father said, yes, I do have their passports. "Would you go to the visa signature page?" asked the man. And he did. And that's where my father, for the first time, saw the name Aristides de Souza Mendez. Souza who? Souza Mendez. You see, my grandparents' names had been found in this ledger book, in a registry book in Lisbon, Portugal, that had been kept by Souza Mendez. Here are their visa numbers, 961, 962, that were signed. You can't see the date, but it was May 24, 1940. Abraham and Eugenia. And it was then that the researcher gave my father a brief overview of the life of Souza Mendez, the diplomat whose name was in their passport and who, through signing their name, got into so much trouble that he was basically erased from history books. Right? Has anyone ever heard of his name before? No. So I said, somebody who helped to rescue my father, and I decided to look into and read a little bit more about Souza Mendez. This is his wife, Angelina, his first cousin. He also had a twin brother named Cesar. Both of them were attorneys. He had a very long career as a diplomat. He had been stationed in San Francisco, Zanzibar, and Antwerp. A big family, 14. And this was his estate. But he was not at his estate in 1940 when all of these visas were being signed. He was in Bordeaux, France. His brother was stationed in Warsaw. Well, Portugal had a dictator named Salazar. Okay. Sousa Mendes knew all of these facts about the leader of his country. He was a lifelong Portuguese citizen, long line of Portuguese. And he knew by Circular 14 that it forbade him from helping anyone trying to come into Lisbon. But Portugal was not really so neutral. Now remember, we have a Catholic, devout Catholic, 14 children there in Bordeaux, France with his family. What was he going to do? Salazar had millions of supporters in Portugal. But this was the scene in June of 1940. Thousands of refugees swarmed, went into Bordeaux searching for a way to get out. It was in this crowd of people, Sousa Mendes in the evenings used to go out and talk to refugees who were coming through. It was in this crowd of people that he met a very religious rabbi named Rabbi Kruger, who was there with his family. And he invited the rabbi and his 5 daughters back to his house. Rabbi Kruger, I'm going to give you a visa so you and your daughters can leave. And Rabbi Kruger said, absolutely not. I can't leave my brothers and sisters behind. What was he going to do? See, it was this time, this is a close-up of the visa. It was this time when a diplomat had an incredibly important job that they could have done. And only a few diplomats did the right thing. A life-saving, this piece of paper could have rescued thousands. And remember, diplomats, have you ever been to a consulate to go to China, to go to a country where you need a visa? They can issue thousands of them if they wanted to. And there were only a few diplomats in Europe who did that, including Sugihara, who's a Japanese diplomat who rescued my great uncle and aunt. So what were they going to do? Here he had that Circular 14 saying no undesirables are allowed in Portugal. You can let them in. And here he had this rabbi beseeching him to do the right thing. He had his Catholicism telling him to do the right thing. And he had his government. Because if you go against your government and do something like that, grave consequences.
For several days, Mendes struggled with himself. He took to his bedroom, tossed and turned on his bed, sweating profusely and occasionally groaning. Despite the agony he was going through, he refused any help from his family. He alternated between intense agitation and passive silence. His son, Pedro Nuno, noticed the change. All of a sudden, my father seemed terribly weary, as though he had been struck down by a violent disease. He just looked at us and went to bed. Another son, Sebastião, remembered his father looking grave. His eyes had blue circles around them. His hair had turned completely gray, as white as snow almost. He remained in that state for 3 days and nights and had no contact with the outside world. On the morning of June 16th, he made up his mind. In the words of Pedro Nuno, my father got up, apparently recovered his serenity. He was full of punch. He washed, shaved, and got dressed. Then he strode out of his bedroom, flung open the door to the chancellery, and announced in a loud voice, "From now on, I'm giving everyone visas. There will be no more nationalities, races, or religions." Then our father told us that he had heard a voice, that of his conscience or of God, which dictated to him what course of action he should take, and that everything was perfectly clear in his mind. With the German army fast approaching Bordeaux, Mendes spent the whole day signing visas, no questions asked. It was a veritable assembly line. Thus began one of the great rescue operations carried out by a single person. Rabbi Kruger reported, "I sat with him a full day without food and sleep and helped him stamp thousands of passports with Portuguese visas. The rabbi also helped by often stepping outside and collecting passports from the waiting people." To his staff, Mendes explained, "My government has denied all applications for visas to any refugees, but I cannot allow these people to die. Many are Jews, and our Constitution says that religion or politics of a foreigner shall not be used to deny him refuge in Portugal. I have decided to follow this principle. I am going to issue a visa to anyone who asks for it, regardless of whether or not he can pay. Even if I am dismissed, I can only act as a Christian, as my conscience tells me."
It is actually reported that his hair did turn white after that experience. And he started signing visas, thousands of them. They set up an assembly line. His older sons learned to forge his signature. They started signing as well. When he heard that in Bayonne, France, the consulate there had stopped signing visas, he went to Bayonne. He set up an assembly line there and continued to stamp the visas. Soon the Spanish guards caught on that the refugees were not supposed to be passing through Spain. But Sousa Mendes was very smart. He went a little bit further down the road with a group of people who had been denied passage, and he found a border crossing where they didn't have telephones, and he helped those people to escape. So these are just a few people who he saved. Salvador Dali, top left-hand corner. Where would we be without Curious George and the man with the yellow hat? Well, trouble soon caught up with him. The Portuguese government found out what he was doing. He was sent back to Portugal, and he was severely punished. It's supposed to say he. Portugal wanted to claim that they were neutral, but they took severe and merciless action against him, as you can see. He tried for clemency, he was denied. Salazar, the dictator, refused to even meet with him. And if you'd like to hear a little fact, Salazar, after the war, he himself claimed to have rescued all of those refugees. In 1954. He's the example of moral courage. And shortly before his death in 1954, he met up with Rabbi Kruger again, and this is what he said. By following what he knew was right, by listening to what was in his heart, he rescued thousands of people. But this is what happened. His family estate, disrepair. They were shamed. His family, most of them had left the country. So here I am. I've had a really nice life. I'm having a really nice life. I shouldn't say had. I'm having a really nice life. I get to be here with you this morning. Incredibly blessed with a wonderful family, a nice house, and my life. What do you do when you learn something like that? It really changes you. I had heard my father's story my whole life about how he escaped, but then to learn that there were certain people along the way, this man, Sousa Mendez, who saved us, what do you do with that kind of information? So I joined the board of the Sousa Mendez Foundation, and I get to visit with nice schools like this one. Thank you very much. We show movies, but probably the best thing was that they arranged for a trip so we could follow in the footsteps of the refugees. So I took my dad when he was 80, on this trip, and we went from Bordeaux into Lisbon, and that trip was so meaningful for him that on the last day of the trip, he got up on stage in front of our whole group and he said, I want you to call me Stefan. He realized how important it was to use that name. We met the President of Portugal, we went to the Presidential Palace, we went and met the UN Secretary General. So it's been really, really an incredible experience, but also as the family historian, you also learn about all of the terrible things that happened. When my grandmother and father said goodbye to my great-grandparents at the train station, it was a goodbye. My great-grandfather died of a heart attack in the Łódź ghetto in 1941. My grandmother's mother, Chaya, was sent to a death camp called Chełmno, which was right outside of Łódź. And my father's beloved uncle, Piotr, the one who he used to play trains with. Piotr survived the entirety of the Łódź ghetto, all the way until 44, and he was still standing. Any men who were still standing then got sent to Auschwitz, but the Germans by then had run out of workers, so Piotr was sent to a slave labor camp in Hanover, Germany, where he was a slave laborer for the Continental Tire Factory. Continental Tire Factory then had a commandant who was a soccer coach turned sadist, and he tortured his slaves there. Piotr died, I discovered here, November 15 of 44, of tuberculosis or pleurisy, but we all know that they died of malnutrition, starvation, or maybe he had been murdered. But even with that, a lot of sadness, there are some moments of peace. I found the final resting place of my great-grandfather, so I installed a tombstone for him. No one in my family ever knew that the Jews of Hanover, who came to where Continental Tire was, had already put in a tombstone for the slaves that were there. And I was able to put a stone on my great uncle's tombstone there. So, 3 lucky Polish Jews who escaped. Remember we talked about the number 233,000? 10,000 survived. I know it sounds like a big number, 10,000, but if we look at, I don't know if there's 100 people in this room. If there's 100 people in this room, only 4% of you survived. All right, math magicians, how many of you lived? 4. All right. Who lived and who died? Who was lucky? Who was blessed? 4%. It's a tiny, tiny number. Well, as long as we're remembering people, we have one more person to remember. My father survived the war, lived in a bomb shelter, watched burning buildings, but he could not survive COVID. In closing, this detective work is emotionally exhausting, but it's also made me very, very empathetic to those trying to escape and those who are suffering. So for those people you see in the news, can you transform their intense fear and anguish? Can you give them a life of laughter and love and happiness like I've had? Like Susan Mendez did for thousands. It's a little bit of moral courage. Can you show compassion for those who are running for their lives? Whether it's from war, whether it's from famine, whether it's from drug cartels, they need us. Each and every one of us can make an impact in a stranger's life. A child, a mother, someone's grandma, any human struggling. I mean, just look at those faces. They're so cute. But that was a long time ago. They're no longer that little. They're still kind of cute, though. So whatever form of moral courage, those are my sons, by the way, sorry, those are my sons. Whatever form of moral courage you can pull from inside of you in the coming years, it's going to be worth it. Here they are today. Give me one more second. If you save a life, then you save a world. And just imagine what that person can do if you save them. Thank you very much.